Euro Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and we continue our recap of the year that we have all just endured, which is hopefully coming to an end soon, unless this is an awful Groundhog Day type of experience. So with that said, my next guest, you know him if you pay attention to this program at all. Probably if you don't, you know him as well. Richard Wolff is an economist. He is professor emeritus at the, I'm going to try to remember, is at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is professor at NYU, is a new school, I think, the new school. And He is the host of Is that right?
All right. You're right 100%.
So far, so good. Nice to get such a good grade. Andy is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV on Tuesday evenings, and his latest book is The Sickness in the System. So first of all, assuming I continue to score well on that entrance examination, first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
And secondly, we are recording this, in case our listeners don't know, on Thursday, and the agreement regarding COVID that appears to be in the stages of being finalized in Congress right now seems to me in a way to be a sort of replica in miniature of the sort of political and economic history of the last year. And I say that because, for example, if I go on the Wall Street Journal, I see headlines like this one: U.S. stocks rise to record levels on stimulus bets. Now that to me stimulates a sense of deja vu about the year we've just seen. First of all, because stocks keep rising, and secondly, because now it's been many years since I studied economics in college, but this is not what one normally thinks of as a stimulus, unless I'm recalling correctly. That's something that floats stocks to ever higher record levels, while at the same time, 8 million more people plunge into poverty, for example. So correct me, is my understanding of economics defective here, or are we using the wrong terminology as a nation?
Well, I think in a way, the answer is that economics always was a contested terrain. It always encompassed not only different perspectives and different theories, but often clashing perspectives and theories. And depending on which ones you found persuasive, the kinds of policies you would propose to deal with problems will be correspondingly different. So let me give you an example from right now. The Democrats think that there ought to be a big, quote unquote, stimulus. The reason they call the bill stimulus is because it sounds good. That is, the government is going to do something to, quote unquote, stimulate the economy. And that sounds like it means something like getting more people into a job, getting more income earned by people who need it. I mean, there's a stunning statistic that everybody should understand, that over the last 8 or 9 months, more than 60 million Americans, greater than 1/3 of our labor force, had to apply for unemployment compensation. Some of those people, millions, have been unemployed the entire 8 or 9 months. Others have been unemployed for a few weeks and everything in between. But you know, it doesn't really matter, because if you're without work for several weeks, remember, it always takes time to get the forms filled. It always takes time before the first check arrives. The checks are, your coverage is not retroactive. So you lose money. And by the way, in most cases, unemployment compensation is less than what you earn. So what happens? If you have any savings, you use them up. If you have friends and relatives that you have a good relationship with, you lean on them and they help you, although it's hard these days because they're having financial troubles too. Well, now at the end of 8 or 9 months, then, if you're lucky, you have a job and some income, But if you had savings, you've lost them. If you had a nest egg, you've used it up. If you had anything, you have less of it now. If you're like many millions, you have deferred paying your rent or your mortgage or various other debts, and they sit there piling up on you. You need help. You need significant help. Having not paid rent for months means you're behind thousands of dollars. Therefore, the proposal of this bill, in its various formulations, Republican, Democrat, White House, compromise, they are all proposing very, very small cash outlays for everybody. Some of them are proposing no outlay at all. They are proposing very modest increases in unemployment coverage. $300 is the number I hear a lot. Long story short, this is an extreme example of way too little and too late. This is not a stimulus. This is barely a relief bill. You're providing some relief for people who are in desperate economic shape. And it's all made worse, to pick up on something you said, RJ. It's all made worse by looking, for example, at the already rich billionaires in our country. There's only a few hundred of them. And when you add up what the last 8 or 9 months have meant for them, as somebody recently did, the total increase in the wealth of our billionaires has exceeded 1 trillion with a T over the same period that a third of our labor force had to go on unemployment. Many have no job at all. Many have used up whatever savings they have. You have here the most glaring worsening of inequality that I can imagine. So that at the same time that we're all supposed to get together and get through this pandemic, this economic crisis, as if we were all holding hands, doing something together because we all face a common danger, that is simply not true. Some people are making out like the bandits they are at the expense of vast numbers of people whose economic situation has deteriorated with very, very little chance of any recuperation of what they've lost. So for me, watching the disconnection between what we need as a society as we go through the worst public health disaster in a century, at the same time as we have the worst economic crash in a century. As we go through this, to see what these politicians are doing is an exercise in whatever the opposite of a democratic system is.
Now, as thinking about the mechanism by which this $1 trillion of wealth, for example, has been transferred to, I think it's 651 billionaires, something like that, tiny number of billionaires in this country that you mentioned earlier, and to other wealthy people as well. Another headline from the Wall Street Journal today, Richard Wolff, and I choose the Wall Street Journal because it is indisputably not a left-wing or publication. Risky loans, this is the headline, risky loans secure private equity payouts despite downturn. Subheadline, companies borrow heavily to send cash to owners, boosting debt levels. Now, this is, as far as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, directly, or at least in part, the result of the way the first quote-unquote stimulus was structured earlier this year, in that the lending markets understood, the bond markets understood that publicly traded companies had access to Federal Reserve subsidized very low interest loans, which made them feel safe to lend to these corporations whose executives lecture the American people about not taking on debt as a nation, take on an enormous amount of debt to pay themselves and their shareholders dividends, and without any concern for what's going to happen later with those debts. And the wealth transfer upwards, the class war against the working people of this country continues. Have I misinterpreted these facts?
No, I would say it slightly differently, but the gist of what you say is exactly right. Let's start with this simple reality. Over the last decade, the corporate sector of America faced a whole host of problems. Problems with their workers, problem with their supply chains around the world, problem with growing competition, particularly from China, but from other countries too. In some ways, these were the usual kinds of problems corporations face. But because we had had the crash of 2008, the reserves, the ability to deal with their problems was badly compromised. So they wanted a way to solve their problems that was easy, quick, and cheap. And so they went to the government, which after all they control with their donations and their lobbyists and their wealth and their influence. They went to that government, particularly the Federal Reserve, and said, okay, here's what we want. We want you to solve the problems of the United States economy, or at least say that that's what you're doing. And then say the way to do it is to print and create vast amounts of new money and lend that money to us at virtually no cost, an interest rate at or near zero. And that's exactly what we have been doing for the last decade, Republican and Democrat alike. Powell, Janet Yellen, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. They all do it. And so what we have had is the increase of our money supply by trillions, that's plural with a T, of dollars, being lent to banks and corporations at zero. So now no one should be surprised. Guess what? The corporations borrowed like crazy a limitless amount of money at virtually barely above zero interest rate. That's virtually free money. Whatever problems you have, whether it's with your workers, whether it's with your shareholders, whether it's with your suppliers, the quickest, easiest, cheapest way to solve it, borrow more money. And that's what our corporate sectors did. So that I can give you the following statistic. Business in America is deeper in debt by any and all measures than at any time in its history. Something on the order of a fifth, 20% is the rough number being used these days, of American corporations have a new name. They are called zombie corporations. Why? Simple answer. The profits they earn from their regular business are insufficient to cover the interest they owe on the loans they've taken out. Because even though the interest rates are low, they have borrowed so much that they're no longer viable as businesses. That's called zombies, the walking dead corporations. And you know, they continue to survive. They go back to the Federal Reserve and they borrow the money they need to pay off the debts that their profits are not enough to pay off. Thereby, of course, getting through another year, but adding to the crazy levels of debt so that companies that are not quite zombies this year will be next year, just as this year's zombies were greater than last year's. This is a story about which we know the following. it will not end well. It can go on for a while. You can use your money the way the Wall Street Journal correctly said. Corporations can borrow the money from the Fed and give it to their shareholders as dividends. Give it to their executives as enormous pay packages. Boost the reputation of the company. Keep the game going until the day arrives that something goes wrong and everybody realizes that the zombie is dead, at which point there will be the withdrawal of the goodwill, of the trust, of the confidence. And then the shareholders, terrified by what is looming, start selling their shares so that they don't get hurt. And of course, that brings the very crash they fear. We've been there before many times. It looks that way, now. So you wonder to yourself whether behind the facade of this all making sense, the reality is that the folks at the top of our capitalist system, the boards of directors, the CEOs, the major shareholders, big banks and capital companies that own everything, whether what's really in their mind is that mentality we used to call grab it before it all disappears. My suspicion, they know that, and that's what we're living through.
And it sounds, Richard Wolff, this process you're describing sounds like one in which all managerial competence is not only not required, but might even be an impediment to being a senior corporate executive nowadays, because it might distract you from the business of mining as much of this debt-driven income for yourself and your shareholders as you can before you get out of the way. It makes me feel, and I've felt this way at various other times, as if we no longer, if we ever did, live in a kind of capitalism where, whatever you think of the rentier class or the investor class, where a television company is in the business of making televisions, and a phone company is in the business of keeping people connected by phone. They're all sort of financial predators now who parenthetically at times have to generate televisions or phones as a kind of waste product of the deal making and wealth extraction. I imagine that's an overly cynical way to express that, but is there any element of truth in that?
Yes, I don't think it's cynical at all. I think it's spot on. You've understood it. Again, let me say it in a slightly different way that may help people understand what insight you just offered. Competition is one of the basics of capitalism. We are told that all the time, and then carefully given a rendition of what competition is that makes it wonderful, makes it feel sort of like apple pie and Christmas dinner and mama and a lovely fire in the fireplace. Does competition have some positive dimensions? Sure it does. But here's what is left out of the story. Dimensions. And let me show you how it works here. Imagine half a dozen companies making something. Automobiles, software, haircuts, it doesn't matter. One of them starts playing the kind of financial game we're talking about. They don't care about, let's say, the automobile, if that's the kind of company it is. They realize they can make more money the following way. They're going to borrow at the Federal Reserve at little or no cost. They're going to use the money and they're going to give more dividends to their shareholders who say, wow, look at the generosity of the company giving us dividends. We want to buy more stocks, and that drives up the price of the shares. And the world looks at the company and says, well, this company is doing well. Look what's happening to their dividends. Look what's happening to their shares. Okay, now next door is another automobile company. It really is committed to producing automobiles, but it is losing sales because people here about the so-called profits and stock prices and dividends by the competitor. And the poor company that's really committed to the automobiles realizes they're going to be competed out of existence unless they do what that company that started this process is already doing. They have to survive competitively, so they go and borrow money and they pay it out to their shareholders to boost their shares and keep themselves going. That's competition, but it's competition that destroys the productivity of enterprises and makes them financial hustles and hustlers instead. There's nobody directing this game. It's the way capitalist competition works. And that's what you're seeing right now. That's why we have this peculiar dichotomy between a booming stock market and literally collapsed economy in Main Street, big city, little city, urban, rural, everywhere, because the economy can't function since we aren't anymore about producing goods and services, generating a public that can afford to buy them. We are playing financial games. We are playing with a kind of monopoly game in which the big corporations dictate to the government the policies that enhance the corporations who use their extra money to buy the politician. And this is the story, if you like, of how empires collapse. And in my judgment, and I have not felt this way before this year, that's where we are. The failure of the United States to manage this pandemic, which we knew was coming. You know, we had a viral pandemic like this a century ago, the Spanish flu in 1918. We've had viruses since then. We know our medical profession is very good. It knew, like everybody does who pays attention, that you're always vulnerable to a virus. They've always been with us. We should have been prepared. We failed. We always have had economic downturns. Capitalism has one every 4 to 7 years. We had one in 2000. We had one in 2008. And here it is. We have one in 2020. 3 crashes in 20 years, right on schedule, 4 to 7 years. We weren't prepared for this one either. A society as smart as us, a society as rich as this, a society with an army of economists, myself included, who study this and propose and analyze. We had all the ingredients to be ready and to contain this. Other countries with less money and less wealth and less cultural development than we have managed to deal with it. We haven't. That has to be faced. That's not a sign of this or that president or this or that political party. That is systemic collapse, incapacity.
The
end of feudalism was good.
So will we look back? I guess this will be my final. Can you hear me? Will we look back? Will we look back on 2021, since I know you're going to have to leave shortly, as the year that was the beginning of the end? That phrase has been bouncing around my head for the last several days. Do you think that's how we'll remember this year? Or 2020? Excuse me, I meant 2020.
Yes, I think so. I think we're going to remember this the way scholars and historians remember the bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 13th, 14th century in Europe, when millions of serfs died of the disease, could not produce any more for their feudal lords. The system had weakened. The system was exhausted. The disease was at the same time, the result of feudalism's internal contradictions, and in turn, a provocation of worsening them. And I don't think feudalism ever recovered. It went into a decline in very short order in historical time. You had the Renaissance, you had the Reformation, and it culminates in the French and American revolutions, which are the final end of feudalism and the welcoming of capitalism. Notice, the beginning of the end of feudalism was a system too conflicted, too unequal, too exhausted to be able to manage rats and fleas, which is what brought them the Black Death. And here we are, the established capitalisms of Western Europe and North America, and we can't do it. And much of the rest of the world can. And no one is missing this. Even Americans committed to denying are being forced every day to confront this reality, especially now that it is working its way literally into every corner of American society. I wish I could stay with you longer. The good news is that perspectives like ours are now in demand, and I have to respond. I look forward, however, to talking with you again soon, RJ.
As do I. In the meantime, have a wonderful holiday, and we'll talk to you afterwards.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.